You said earlier in the interview that as technically it is not only a worldview, but atheism tends to be a religion. I have to ask, you said now that with a lack of epistemology, a lack of foundation, an inability to prove its prime conclusion, that is, and that being there is no God, isn't that the very epitome and definition of blind faith?
Yeah, well, everybody has faith. There's no question about it. We can't prove everything. We're not omniscient. We're not all-knowing. So everybody has to have that element of faith. But the question is our faith founded on the evidence, or does our faith go against the evidence? And when everything is said and done, I mean, even the advances of modern science was founded by Bible-believing Christians. And they felt comfortable exploring the universe because they claimed to be thinking God's thoughts after him. You see, they believed that a rational God created humans in his image so that we were rational, and created the universe in a way that makes sense so that through reason we could really find truth about the universe in which we live. Now, atheists have destroyed the basis for modern science, but they still want us to believe that the sense perception is reliable, our sense experiences are reliable, we really can know truth, we can really make moral judgments. All these things are borrowed capital from the Christian worldview. These are not things that are found in the atheistic universe or in the atheistic bank account.
Well, that settles it for me. I'm so tired of being called a deluded person having blind faith when we do have historical accounts then of Jesus or of other biblical figures, a nation that exists to this day, that would be the Jewish nation. Lots of things. I admit my presuppositions, and so have you, and yet we can defend our faith.
Yeah, and we need to test those presuppositions. And but let me say this one more thing before we talk about historical evidences for Jesus, of which there are many. But the fact of the matter is, though we all have presuppositions, and those presuppositions can be tested, and we don't have to have blind faith, the fact of the matter is, it seems to me that with most people, it's not intellectual things that are keeping them from God as much as it's a choice, a volitional, choice of the will. And there's within each of us, there's a drive for human autonomy. We want to be God. We want to be boss. And then there's a thirst for God. And I think those who favor the thirst for God start to move towards God's throne room. But if human autonomy, if being your own king, and if having a distaste for God's authority, if that's the primary focus of your life, then I would not expect you to deal honestly with the evidence. So we can remove intellectual smokescreens by presenting evidence for the Christian faith and for the existence of God. But in the end, the atheist has to do some soul searching and decide if he wants to. God has given us the free will. If it's pouring rain, a person can sit there and say, no, it's a beautiful day. I deny it's raining. We have that free will. And so we can deny the truth even if it's staring us in the face.
Well, one quick final note that we would like to share for any of you that are viewing that are interested more in God, in Yahweh God, that we talk about, and Jesus, that very God made flesh that came and died for us. Give us just a few minutes of an explanation of what you believe as a Christian, what you found through the Bible, and a bit of that evidence that we're talking about, what we would call the gospel of Christ.
Yeah, now I reached a skeptical point in my life. I was raised in Roman Catholicism, but by my senior year of high school, I started to doubt God's existence. A lot of my teachers were from the counterculture, from the 1960s and all, and so I was graduating high school in the late 1970s. And so I became rather skeptical. Now, I wish I could say I looked at the evidence and then became a Christian because of the evidence. That wasn't the case, though. It was a need in my life. When I joined the Marine Corps, it was much more boring than I thought. And so in 1981, I was looking for adventure in the Marine Corps, and I had a real boring duty guarding nuclear weapons. And, terrorists don't usually mess with Marines guarding nuclear weapons. They're too busy killing women and children. So my job was incredibly boring. And I grew up in New Jersey, lived a fast-paced life, and the boredom was literally driving me to where I thought driving me to insanity. And so I started looking. I felt the need, a void in my life, and started looking for answers. And when I was then confronted with the gospel message, it made sense, and I accepted Jesus. Now, right after accepting Jesus, I started witnessing to my fellow Marines, and I found they had a lot of objections I used to have as a skeptic. And I thought it would just not be fair to expect them to believe apart from evidence. And so I began to study the field of apologetics and look into the evidences, and then began to present evidence for Christianity and for the existence of God. And so as I looked at the Bible, what I found was the Bible is better attested than any ancient document from the 1st century A.D. There's more manuscript evidence for it. I mean, we have over 5,000 ancient handwritten copies in Koine Greek of the New Testament alone, not to even mention other ancient copies in other languages, other translations. And again, ancient copies. So you have more copies. The copies are much closer to the originals than any other ancient 1st century document. So just based on the manuscript of it, and then the amount of agreement between them, you have many variants. Bart Ehrman is blowing those way out of proportion. You have many variants, like misspelled words in some of the copies and things of that sort. But when you compare the copies and you just remove the variants and you say, okay, here's the significant differences, then you're talking about 0.5% of the text. And when you have these tens of thousands of copies, you can figure out who got it wrong in those cases. So for all practical purposes, we know exactly what the original said. You can't say that about anything else from ancient literature. Closest thing to it would be Homer's Iliad, and there you have about 95% agreement between 643 copies, which is certainly less than the tens of thousands of copies of the New Testament manuscripts that we have. So on the manuscript evidence alone, the New Testament should be trusted more than anything else from ancient literature. And if you can't trust the New Testament as being historically reliable and what was really originally written, then we shouldn't trust any 1st century A.D. history. So it's a double standard. Those who accept all this historical data on the Caesars but reject the historical data found in the New Testament. I mean, we could just go to the Apostolic Fathers, just 3 of them, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement of Rome, who all wrote by 110 AD or earlier, and those guys allude to or quote from as authoritative 25 out of the 27 New Testament books. So there was no question. These were bishops of Antioch, bishops of Smyrna, bishop of Rome. These were guys, the key leaders in the early church, and they already knew which books belonged in the New Testament. And they were pupils of the apostles, selected by the apostles to lead the early church. So we have ample evidence for the historical reliability of the New Testament. And if people want to call the Apostle Paul a liar and the New Testament authors a liar, they're free to do so, but then they have to explain how men would die for what they know to be a hoax. And that goes against human nature. They sincerely believed that they had seen Jesus of Nazareth risen from the dead on numerous occasions, and they were sincere enough to suffer and to die for those beliefs. Now, I will agree, those who hijacked, the Islamic hijackers who flew their planes into the Twin Towers and killed our people on 9/11, they were sincere enough in their Islamic beliefs to die for those beliefs. I will grant them that. But I can give you lots of reasons, and many people can give you lots of reasons. Atheists can even give you lots of reasons as to how they would be mistaken to believe that Muhammad is God's prophet and that the Quran is the word of Allah or the word of God. We can give you lots of reasons as to how they could be sincere but mistaken. With Christianity, it's different. You have to explain you have to explain how the apostles could be sincere in their belief that they saw Jesus alive on numerous occasions after his death, yet be mistaken. Sincere enough to die for those beliefs, yet mistaken. It's been 2,000 years, and there are no adequate alternative naturalistic explanations of the resurrection. So at this point in time, about 98 to 99% of the world's leading New Testament scholars acknowledge that Jesus died by crucifixion, and that the apostles, and that the apostle Paul, and that James, the half-brother of Jesus, all had experiences in which they thought they saw the risen Christ, that he appeared to them after his death, and that it radically transformed their lives so that they were willing to die for that belief. Now, based on that alone, over 70% of New Testament scholars acknowledge the empty tomb. For those scholars that don't acknowledge the empty tomb, there's good arguments to argue for that as well. You put that together, and those points that I gave you just there, right there, refute all the alternative explanations. The only plausible explanation of that data accepted by the vast majority of New Testament scholars, is that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, the New Testament scholars that don't want to believe in the resurrection, they will say, well, I accept this data, I just don't accept the resurrection. You ask them, well, then what is your alternative explanation? They say, well, I don't have one, because they know that they all have been refuted by liberal scholars themselves in the late 19th century.
Are New Testament scholars then all Christian? Who are these New Testament scholars?
Yeah, I debated Robert Price, who's a New Testament scholar with the Jesus Seminar. He even denies that Jesus existed. He denies that the Apostle Paul wrote anything of the New Testament, whereas the vast majority of New Testament scholars will give you at least 7 of Paul's writings. But most New Testament scholars at least do not start out as believers. Most New Testament scholars are like most human beings. They're not born-again Christians. And so when they've been learned to take a critical approach to the New Testament and try to assume New Testament passages are false unless they find evidence that they can't refute, and then they'll accept those passages as being true. So New Testament scholars started in the 1860s, 1870s, acting like Jesus was a myth and he never really existed. But as time went on, even with their biased principles against the reliability of the New Testament, they've reached the point now where the vast majority of New Testament scholars will give you so much historical data about the historical Jesus that we can build an incredibly strong case for his bodily resurrection from the dead. But the idea that the New Testament scholars are Bible-believing Christians that are just trying to defend their biases, I would argue it's more likely that these guys became New Testament scholars trying to tear down the Bible, and it's not the other way around. There are evangelical New Testament scholars, but they're in the minority. They're a very small subset of New Testament scholars today.